Welcome to everyone joining us for today's LinkedIn Live, hosted by myself, Aman Kidwai. With the rise of remote and hybrid work and an increasingly globalized workforce, we're starting to see more small and mid-sized businesses hiring beyond US borders. But there's still a lot of uncertainty on what they need to know when bringing on global talent. Today, we're diving into new research from Liz Wilkie, principal economist at Gusto, and her team. It showcases what's driving SMBs to hire beyond the US and what opportunities and challenges they face when bringing on international talent. Again, I'm Aman Kidwai, journalist, reporter on The Workplace, formerly at Morning Brew, Fortune, and Business Insider, currently freelancing. And I'll let my fellow speakers introduce themselves, starting with Liz.
Great. Thanks, Aman. Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Wilkie. I am the principal economist at Gusto, and I'm very happy to be sharing some of the data and research that we've done here, and I will pass it over to Job.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, everybody. I'm Job van der Voort. I'm co-founder and CEO at remote.com. And that's it. I'll just be commenting on Liz's findings, I think.
Wonderful. Well, if you guys want to access that research, you can check out the link in the comments. I also want to encourage folks to feel free to drop questions in the chat. We'll be taking questions at the end of this session, but you can feel free to send your submissions in at any time. Also, this is the second of 3 LinkedIn Live sessions Gusto will be hosting around remote and hybrid work, including working with remote employees around the world. If you're a business owner trying to figure out how to hire your first international employee, don't forget to tune in tomorrow to our 3rd LinkedIn Live, where they'll answer some of those common questions. All right, let's get into our discussion. Liz, tell us about the research you and your team recently produced and how and why SMBs are turning to global talent. Why is this shift happening?
Yeah, so I'm going to sort of give a little bit of context about why we did this work. So obviously, we have a recently announced partnership Gusto does with Remote, which facilitates employer of record arrangements around the world for companies. And, small businesses aren't the segment of the business market that you normally think about as really having a large demand for international talent. We had previously done a lot of research on remote and hybrid work. And in one of our surveys, we asked our small business customers if they had an international employee, because we'd seen this rise in international contractors, which I can talk about a little bit too. And a surprising number of them said that they already had an international employee, which I think speaks to the reason to have this partnership with Remote to sort of facilitate small and medium-sized businesses sort of getting better access to overcome some of the challenges that we'll talk about. But what we effectively did is we sort of implemented a whole survey. We wanted to know what they're doing, where they're hiring, what challenges they're facing, and also, how they're creating cohesive, high-performing teams. So I'll sort of share my screen here, and I'll just sort of tee up a couple of the findings that we've got. So, the long and the short of it is that these SMBs really are looking overseas for the right talent at the right price. Mostly businesses, 3 out of 4 businesses hire overseas for cost reasons. They want to manage costs. Talent is getting more and more expensive in the United States. But almost 60% of them also said that there are unavailable workers in the US with the right skills, right? So either they couldn't get enough people into their talent pool, or, the talent that they were getting was just so expensive on their thin margins, right? Or to serve the needs that they have. But then actually a little surprising to me, but not in hindsight, is that a lot of companies are hiring international workers to expand their ability to serve markets beyond the US. And that was more true in Canada and Europe than it was for other places, but it was pretty common across the board. And so what we're seeing is that a lot of businesses are really looking to international talent to sort of supplement their teams and expand their ability, right, to do international operations. What I did find really interesting is that nearly 2/3 of businesses that we surveyed, the mostly professional and tech-based industries, said that they had a US-based remote employee before they hired their first international employee. And what it turns out is that of those, almost 3/4 of them said that the experience of having a remote employee actually made it easier to think about having an international employee, because they've already sort of done some of the work of managing to outcomes and hiring across time and space. And so it almost is like a little bit of training wheels for SMBs that are thinking about hiring internationally. The remote experience of managing a remote employee really facilitated like some of their confidence to be able to manage people across borders. But it's not all sort of beautiful roses and daisies and everything's fine. There are really significant challenges. And the biggest one of those, and I think Job, you'll have a ton of experience to add to this, is that understanding and complying with tax and labor laws, right? So in the United States, most people before they start a business have been an employee or they've had a job. They're familiar with the US context, and it's easy to understand even like which agency you need to go to file a paper, or you sort of can get it on Google. And I think businesses really found it challenging to understand what the requirements even are. And that's a major barrier to them sort of thinking about how to do this. Another major barrier is actually just knowing what pay and benefits package is going to be competitive and is going to attract the right talent, right? So do I need to pay, $10,000 a month for this person? Do I need to pay $1,000 a month for this person? And how do I know, right, that I'm offering something in the marketplace that's really going to be competitive and compelling in order to get that right talent? And then fully on, similarly, half said that the actual costs of filing the paperwork and ensuring that they're in compliance, especially in sort of an unknown system, these are all major challenges for them just in the sort of hiring and setting up, right, an establishment overseas in order to be able to contract these folks. But I mean, despite those challenges, the businesses that we spoke to were sort of overwhelmingly positive about the experience, despite the sort of headwinds that they face with compliance. And so 3/4 of them said that they intend to increase their international headcount over the next 1 to 3 years. And that's not at the exclusion of increasing their US-based headcount. Most companies we talked to actually are looking to increase both. But 3 out of 4 of them said, we are definitely looking to hire more people internationally. So sort of despite all of those challenges, I think small and medium-sized businesses are really sort of starting to wake up to the opportunity, but also then to take advantage of platforms like Gusto in partnership with Remote, right, that are offering some, support and help and education to help businesses sort of get around what they perceive as obstacles, right, to accessing this talent.
So, Job, from your perspective, sounds like, or from the perspective of this research, it sounds like we have a few different factors at play: managing costs, addressing talent shortages, and a desire to expand into new markets as kind of the driving factors behind the expansion of remote and international hiring. How does that line up with your experience with Remote's customers?
That's exactly what we see, right? I think most of our customers, the way they hire is they look for somebody great, and then they discover, oh, that person lives in a place where I never hired somebody before. And I think that is the most prevalent way that we see. But yeah, it lines up exactly. I mean, we have a very biased worldview because all our customers and everybody that I speak to does exactly this. They are looking to hire internationally. But it's exactly for these reasons. And we see more and more companies hire not just in one other country, but in 10 different countries, right? And I'm not talking about very large companies. I'm talking about SMBs that hire maybe 30 people in 10 different countries. That is becoming much, much more prevalent. And you can easily imagine this, right? Because if you hire in a small set of time zones, you quickly cover tens of different countries.
Yeah. And Liz, of course, these companies want to hire international employees. You mentioned some blockers maybe a little bit earlier. Can you go into more detail? What does that typically look like when when there are some factors in the way from companies hiring international employees?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's this sort of numbers about compliance and tax, and I'm going to separate between the hiring or the actual just sort of contracting with somebody and then the actual management, when they get on board. We can talk about that in a minute. But I think overall what this says to me is that there's a real opacity and a real cost, right, about understanding what the requirement is, which is hard enough in an environment that you're very familiar with, right? But then it sort of compounds, right, when the documentation is in a different language, and the agencies aren't agencies that you've ever heard of, and maybe they handle things the same way or maybe different, and there are cultural differences, right, with what you can expect about how this stuff gets done. And I think one of the things that small businesses feel is sort of risky, right, is getting in trouble with the government, right, especially a government that's, that's not even your own. And I think it just sort of really says is that the costs of knowledge, right, are quite high. Business owners are pressed for time. They wear many different hats, and the sort of difficulty of knowing with certainty and with surety are one of the major barriers. And then I think that sort of extends to the fact that business owners really said that the figuring out what the right talent and compensation and benefits package is that's actually going to be meaningful, right? Just because businesses want to manage costs doesn't mean they don't also recognize that if, a person they're looking for is attractive to them, a person they're looking for is attractive to other small businesses, right, in other environments, right? So it doesn't mean that they're sort of scooping up talent that's not competitive. They're scooping up talent that is competitive. And so figuring out what that benefits and compensation structure needs to look like is really tough. It's tough in the United States, right, to know what you should be paying a data scientist in Cincinnati. It's even tougher to know what you should be paying, a systems analyst or a bookkeeper in the Philippines, right? And those, I think, are the major barriers, just knowing and understanding the context, right? That'll help for sort of facilitate all of those actions.
And then Liz, I understand that there's another data point from the research finding that SMBs are actually turning international contractors into international employees. Is this true? And why are SMBs so eager to do this?
Well, I mean, it could sort of give it the joking answer that if you can conceive of a human or a business doing it, you can definitely find an example of a business that's doing it. So it's definitely true. But sort of beyond joking, we did ask, and a bunch of businesses that we said basically did what Job suggested, which is that businesses are looking for the right talent. They want to connect with somebody that they really think is going to be great for the work, and then they find out, right, that they are a couple continents away or on completely different time zones. And then so what often happens first is that they will bring them on as contractors, right? Because it's the fastest way to get them on board and to start to get them paid. You can sort of test out different management styles. The commitment in the relationship is a little bit lower, but it's easier. And then so companies, sort of figure out that they can, right, hire as employees and bring contractors on. It does a lot of things. It sort of cements the relationship. It demonstrates a higher level of commitment on both sides. It also reduces some of the compliance risks, right, that can be attendant with a lot of these relationships. And it also helps SMBs preserve, right, the skills and know-how and intellectual property, right, that these contractors might have access to, right? So it sort of helps keep all of that in-house, in addition to sort of having somebody on the ground in these other markets in case you want to expand. So fully on half of our companies, 47% said that one of the very important reasons for them to make their first international hire was actually to convert an international contractor for all those reasons.
Very interesting. And Job, what has your experience been on the front of moving contractors into employees?
Well, I will say the same thing as Liz was saying with different words. I think there's two sides to it. One is for the employer, right? They want a certain commitment, but I also want to make sure that they are compliant with local labor laws, right? You can't hire a contractor if you treat them like an employee, essentially. And that goes for most countries in the world. And on the other side, if you want to hire a certain person, they might not be willing or able to work as a contractor, right? This means all sorts of different things for your taxation, but it also means, for example, that you're not eligible for our benefits, right? And so as much as in the US as anywhere else in the world, people like to receive benefits from their employer. And so, direct employment is like truly the one way that you can go about that. And ultimately, for many people, I think, we come from a place where, remote workers or people, getting hired from international countries, they tended to be freelancers. That's no longer the case, right? Mm-hmm. So indeed, most people come from a place where they were employed by a local employer previously, and they expect a similar experience where they get their money on the same day that they previously got. They get a normal pay slip. We can file taxes in the normal way, and they don't have to worry about additional bureaucracy or challenges. And so you can only really do this if you are employed by a local employer in some way, and that international employer has to figure out a way to do that.
And then just Job, in follow up to that, noting that the biggest blocker for SMBs hiring internationally was understanding compliance. What are you seeing from Remote's customers in terms of different issues that employers may run into and ways that they power through it?
Yeah, it's the everything. That's the answer. Because if you want to hire somebody in a different country, every country has just started out from scratch designing their laws, rules, and regulations. And so if you want to hire somebody in another country, I mean, the one thing in common most countries have is that there is a contract. But there might be multiple contracts. And they indeed, like Liz was saying before, they might be in a different language that you don't speak, let alone that you have to take into account, well, what does compensation look like? How do I provide benefits? What kind of benefits should I provide? What are local labor laws? What do they look like? How does payroll work? Which currency do I pay somebody? All these questions are extremely hard to answer when you are 10,000 kilometers away. You have never been to this country. You have no local expertise. If you want to hire somebody, that list that I just made, it goes on for a really long time, right? Because it's Halloween in some parts of the world, but in a lot of parts it's not, and it might be a public holiday somewhere. And if it's a public holiday, you have to do particularly. It is really complex. It's really complex to just understand how you can hire somebody, and then once you start to understand how to hire somebody, you have to actually do the work, and the work that is involved is also, that tends to be highly complex, right? You have to set up a local entity, you have to meet all the regulations related to that entity, you have to figure out what kind of entity you have to set up, and then you need to think about, well, how does that fall into my greater corporate structure? You're an SMB, you want to just hire great people, you don't want to be worrying about this like massive compliance, complex legal overhead. And so yeah, the answer is, what are the things that they run into? It's the everything. I have no idea how to hire somebody in another country. I don't even know where to start. And so that's a lot. And I think it's a lot for one country. When I started my first business, I felt like it was a lot in the country where I spoke the language, and I understood the rules, and it was still a lot of work. Now imagine trying to do that in several other countries at the same time just to hire somebody. Yeah, it's everything.
Yeah, that's a lot to deal with. And yeah, every single country has its own different rules. So how can you plan? And then Liz, once you even are able to bring on an international employee, to lean into our Halloween theme, you're not out of the woods yet. What are some of the biggest challenges for SMBs according to what your data has shown?
Yeah, I mean, hands down, the biggest challenge that businesses said was managing and coordinating work across time zones, right? And I live on the East Coast. I work for a company that's based on the West Coast, and even trimming down the number of hours of overlap in a standard workday by 3 hours makes a huge difference, right? In how you coordinate and how you sort of respect people's time. And so you think about a team member who's 6 or 9 or 12 hours, right, time difference from you, and it really can sort of pile up, especially if you're trying to maximize flexible work hours and flexibility for your US based employees, which we know is like a really important part of retention these days, especially for people who have sort of other life duties. So it can be a really hard equation to solve, right? Which is, and making sure that coordination and synchronous work gets done when it needs to be done. So, I mean, about half of our businesses said that was really the number one factor. And it's not an insurmountable obstacle. There are some pretty technical fixes, which are to, set core hours, adjust the working day, right? Maximize asynchronous work or work that's documented. We've done a lot of work on best practices for remote and hybrid companies, and those practices sort of extend overseas, maybe to a more extreme level. And then the other one is about a quarter of our companies said that managing cultural and language barriers was a really big challenge. And then a lot of them get around that by requiring English fluency. Most businesses get around this by just requiring English fluency. And, that just sort of helps them eliminate that challenge itself. A lot of others use text-based translation services. So if I'm writing a message, right, there are lots of services that can translate your message in real time. Google Chat, I was in an Uber a driver who's like real time translating, right? Like talking to me in my language from hers, and she was thrilled to show me that we could communicate. And if this is happening in an Uber, it's happening in an office, right? There's no doubt about that. And then I think the other thing is that companies really, some of them have really invested in just like cultural education about, the culture of the places that their new international employees are working, especially managers, so that they can understand and relate a little better and to sort of manage to outcomes and expectations. And so again, these really aren't insurmountable obstacles, but they are sort of added layers of challenge for management and coordinating work.
Yeah, a lot of different layers to consider there. And the time zone one being a really, really huge challenge. Job, how have you seen companies, clients of remote navigate this getting work done when people and teams are working across multiple time zones and potentially even language and other barriers?
Yeah, I think it's everything Liz said. Sorry, again, I'll just be repeating Liz, but I think there's a few things, and I think it's important to create a strong fundament or foundation in your organization. And in our case, how we did it at Remote internally is having very clear values for the company, which sort of inform what kind of behavior do you expect? What is the standard of a behavior? And then also really clear guidelines around communication, right? How do you communicate with each other? What channels do you use? And then how do you make sure that information is shared proactively so that ultimately you can work asynchronously, so somewhat independent of time zones. I think there's also some common sense in this, right? Which is that if you have a small team, you don't want it to be extremely distributed, because it will make it harder, no matter how well they work asynchronously, it will make it much harder for them to actually effectively communicate. And I think, combine it with like standard practice around asynchronous communication, making sure you write things down and you make them discoverable to your team, you get a really long way. And what we found was that if you have these clear guidelines about how do you communicate, how do you treat each other, then language and cultural barriers start to dissolve, because we all understand from each other that, well, maybe English isn't our first language, but it's the language that we use. And so we're going to be very generous in our interpretations with how we treat each other. And because we have shared values and we know what to expect from each other, we feel safe to communicate with each other. Yeah, and then the rest is just purely operational, which is like, how do I make sure I can have enough hours? How can I avoid meetings, for example? This is one that I like to say very often, that I think one of the worst things you can do in a highly distributed team is set up a lot of recurring meetings, because they tend to make your schedule incredibly inflexible. But it's very normal for organizations to have a lot of recurring meetings, right? Every Friday at a certain time, every Monday morning we have a meeting. Well, Monday morning doesn't exist in a distributed team, because for part of the team it will be Sunday night, and for some of it will be Monday at the end of the day. And so you will have to change the way you think about doing certain things, and try to be more ad hoc and try to more proactively work asynchronously. And that ultimately is what we hear and see that works, besides just avoiding creating teams where one person is in Europe, one in the US, and one in Australia, because they will never find the time to meet with the three of them.
So we talked about getting work done. What about, in terms of building a connected culture among those employees? That's kind of a little bit of a different factor. And how do you think about that when you have a distributed team across multiple different countries?
Yeah, surprisingly, it's mostly the same. So if you create this strong company shared values, right? Like this is really like the scaffolding of culture in an organization. You make sure that people understand this is how we communicate, this is how we treat each other, this is the kind of behavior that we want to see. That's step one. Then you create sort of a safe space that makes it easier for people to connect with each other. Not easier practically, but easier as in like you lower the threshold for people to start, opening up to each other. Then the only thing you have to do is you have to create opportunities where people can opt in to socialize with each other, right? Which ultimately creates connectedness. And I always think about it in a way that you want to create opportunities where people talk with each other. And it doesn't matter if it's text or video or in person, but you want to create those moments that are non-transactional, where you don't need something from the other person, where it's not a check-in on a project, where it's not a team meeting. And so if you create non-transactional moments between individuals in an organization, and you've established, well, we have this shared system of values where, we respect each other and we treat each other well, then you're done. Like people are they're naturally very social, so they will want to connect with each other, especially people that are working distributed team, right? Because their social battery doesn't fill up as quickly as people that step into the office and are immediately faced with other colleagues. And so then they will self-serve and like help themselves almost to this. And then again, like I would always encourage companies to create moments where this becomes more natural. And it could be virtual things. You can set up coffee chats and such, and this could be in-person things, depending on how your company is set up. And it can take any shape or form that you want. But I think it's very important that if you create an organization that is remote and highly distributed, that you give an opportunity for people to connect outside of the direct context of work. And I think is fundamental. And the rest is easy. Once people start talking with each other, it's, your culture starts to build.
Mm-hmm. So we're working asynchronously, we're aligning on values, and then making sure that you have buy-in for folks, and again, keeping a lot of the previous management practices similar, thematically at least, just trying to apply it in a different environment. Putting out a question for both of you now, just maybe broadening our scope a little bit here. We've seen the overall rise in remote work level off recently, with more headlines and companies calling people back to the office. So where do you guys see remote work and international workforces going in the next year or two, or even longer?
All right, I'll go first so that we can save the best for last. I mean, I think I will say I think that we're in the middle of the conversation about remote and hybrid work and RTO. And the business landscape is big enough that many companies can decide that they want to be primarily in person, and many companies can decide that they have other ways to coordinate work, right, that they want to try out. Larger companies that were established before the pandemic have legacies of what I call cultural technology, how people work together, the norms they have about how work should be done. That's all like installed in the company. And the companies that were built in person basically have a cultural technology that's different. Companies that were born sort of after the pandemic are significantly more likely to be born remote or even just partially in person. And I think that they are going to teach us a lot more than large enterprise that existed before the pandemic about how to build effective remote companies. And I think they are also going to teach us a lot about managing across borders. I think that, small businesses in particular, are at the pointy tip of the spear in terms of experimentation with these new forms, because they are agile, they can turn on a dime, they are looking for talent to grow and keep their businesses sort of healthy and thriving, and they are looking for it anywhere they can get it. And I think the expansion of international hiring, as soon as there were platforms, right, and technology available to help them connect, suggests strongly that they are the most able to take advantage of these opportunities. So I don't see that these conversations are in conflict with each other. I see a lot of different trends sort of happening in different parts of the sort of the business and work segment. And I think that given the strong signals that we have from this survey and also from Job's own experience with remote, I don't see that this is a trend that is going to go away anytime soon, even as the conversation about RTO and how much work in the United States should be done in person continues to go on.
Wonderful. And Job, how about you? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I agree with Liz, of course, because it's all very rational and makes a lot of sense. I think the only addition I have to it is that the fundamental forces that drive people to start working remotely, they are increasing in strength. And so what I mean with that is that I think there's two things. One is that, I mean, there's three things in Liz's research, but the two things that I always think about. One is that, there's always a shortage of talent, right, close to your office. And so this will continue to drive remote work, and it continue to drive international hiring as a whole. And that is a trend that will only increase, right? And it is further amplified by the fact that, since COVID, we've realized that, well, if I'm a knowledge worker, if I do most, if not all my work from a computer, I don't have to be in the office to do the work. I might like to be in the office, and in that case, I'll totally work in an office, and that's great, and that's fine. But if my life at the current moment, or because I simply don't want to, I can't be in an office, I don't have to be anymore. And so those two things combined means that the talent pool that works remotely or prefers to work remotely continues to grow. And the appetite for, the demand for talent from employers will always be greater than the supply that they have locally. And, in addition to, things that Liz was already saying, is that, well, there's more technologies available as well. There's more awareness of how you can work remotely. All of those forces contribute that, well, over time, we're going to see more and more remote hiring, remote or international hiring. And I also think, there's a bit of we had this really strong reaction right after COVID because we had to work from home. I don't care about, I work from home, as you can see with all the Lego, but that's not necessarily the only way to work remotely, right? There's many middle grounds in between working remotely from home and working in an office where, you might be more comfortable working from a co-working space or something. But it's very obvious to me that these trends will continue, and remote hiring and more remote positions will become available over time. And for what it's worth, we see this in our own data as well.
Awesome. Well, one more question for the two of you before we get into Q&A from the audience. Again, you guys have the opportunity to send your questions in during this discussion. But final question for me, for you guys, what is the biggest or most important unanswered question that you think about as it relates to remote work and working with global teams?
All right, I'm going to be quick because I really want to hear Job's answer. I think we've only scratched the surface about how to build really cohesive teams and experiences across borders. I think a lot of what we know from management science about how to do that is based on, Western industrialized countries that have similar cultural histories. And I think that as small businesses continue to expand, right, the borders in which they hire, I think that we're just going to learn so much about what it takes to sort of create a really motivated, high functioning team that works in 5 states and 3 countries, right, sort of 24 hours a day. And I think that's both frightening because it's going to probably be painful for many of us that sort of grew up with ways of working and expectations about how it goes. And I also think it's an incredible opportunity to sort of spread connection and think about new ways of working. And then I think there's a big question mark for me in how governments are going to start to regulate labor flows, right, that aren't actually physical across borders, right? So previously, somebody from Kenya or the Philippines would come to the US or vice versa, and it would be very clear that when a physical person is in that country, how, you want to tax them. And I think that, that's going to become less and less a part of, labor migration. And I think the governments are going to have to figure out how they want to manage or regulate that. And I think that's going to be a coming piece of the puzzle.
Yeah,
I mean, as always, I completely align myself with Liz. I think on the last item, and we shared this earlier in private, what we see at remote is very interesting, is that a very large part of the remote workforce, people that are being hired, are not citizens in the country in which they are working from, right? So, for example, here in the Netherlands, we have a team at remote working for Remote, the company, our remote, and only half of the people are Dutch, and the other half are just immigrants, right, or expats, or however you want to call them. But they are people that were not born here; they do not have Dutch nationality, and they're working from the Netherlands. And that is a trend that is accelerating, and that is something that governments are completely uncomfortable with, because they don't know how to deal with these people. They don't know how to treat them. They are taxpayers locally, and so that usually works out. But there's a lot of questions about how to deal with that, and I think this is exactly what Liz was talking about as well. And I find it incredibly interesting. If I think about remote work, I think I lean more into like, what is work going to look like in the future? Because I think it is nice to be around people, right? And I like working remotely, and I like working from home, and I don't enjoy going to a place if that takes me a lot of time. But I do like to be around people. And so how is the nature of work going to be like this, where we look at text and we then have Zoom calls? Because I don't think that's great, right? I think we do it and we accept it because that's what we have today, and the advantages of remote work are absolutely massive. But we should be able to do better than that. And so at Remote, when we started out, actually for a really long time, we experimented with VR because our thesis was that, well, if everybody's in virtual reality, then it is like you are in an office. So you have this like sense of presence of each other, which makes the experience more personal and more real. And it was really exciting, and it works to a certain degree. We had a Christmas party in VR, which is really, really fun, and we played games together in VR. And it did give us a different sense of like, well, what is it like to be close to each other, to these people that are in reality all over the world? And I think in the future, and I don't think the future is too far away, I think it's like 2 to 10 years away. But in the future, we will have more technologies that will give us a greater sense of presence, which ultimately will make work more fun, more personal, and maybe more productive. I'm not sure about that, but maybe more productive, where, you and I, one moment I might be in my office, and the next moment I might still be in my office, but I might be joined almost as if you are in person with me. I think that is not an unrealistic thing. I think there's many technologies available now or over coming years that give you somewhat of a sense of that. And once that becomes, more generally available, I think that will actually change the nature of how we experience work, because the only, advantage of being in office by then are the snacks. I don't have those great snacks at home that, the people at the Gusto office have.
Yeah. Very interesting to think about people putting on a VR headset or AR headset as the way to go to work. Well, wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Liz and Job, for that walk through the research, and Job for your insight from reality. And we're going to move on now to Q&As from the group. This one, the first question we're going to take is from M. Khaled Khan. Thank you so much for your question. As an agency, we have experienced a thin line differentiating the skilled and the right candidates. Human capital is probably the need of the hour for better retention. Job, what do you think about a statement like that, the role of human capital as it relates to differentiation in the goal of international hiring and talent management?
I mean, I agree with the statement. It sounds like it makes sense. I don't have any sensible thing. I think if Khaled says something very smart here, and I'm like, oh yeah, no, I guess I agree with it. Yeah, I don't, and again, like, I don't think it's really different in remote or international situation than it is in an office. But yeah, I think he's right.
Liz, any thoughts to add?
Yeah, I mean, my thought, I think, is that we often think about the difference between the cost of a hire and the talent or the skills or the productivity, right? The value of a hire, when actually they're just two parts of the exact same equation. So if you don't have the right skills, it doesn't matter how cheap you are, right? Because you can't do the job I need you to do. And so it's and if you have exactly the right skills and you're too much, right? And I can't afford you. It actually doesn't matter how skilled you are. And employers do think about what the trade-offs are between paying more for a higher skilled person and paying less for a lesser skilled person. And I don't mean lesser skilled sort of across the board. I mean to do the job that they need done in the environment and under the conditions that they need it to be done. Employers really think about, who do I need to do this job? How much do I have to pay? What is this person worth to me, or to the business? And I think that, it's simply not a matter of costs. We ask businesses, do you care about cost more or skills? And they frequently hate answering this question because it's not an either or from them. It's a series of trade-offs and calculations. And so I think I would completely agree that with the statement that skills and retention, are really important parts of the cost calculation, right? Because it's you're sort of trying to optimize the value that you can get out of a worker, right? For what it costs the business to have them.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how retention goes for companies with international employees. All right, our next question comes from an anonymous LinkedIn user who thanks us for organizing this discussion, and then asks, I understand that businesses are looking to employ the most experienced professionals to optimize cost. However, what encouragements are given to newer professionals with lesser years of experience?
I think it's the same as in other businesses, right? I think businesses do want to hire across the stack. If you're going to hire someone who is more experienced, they are going to be more expensive. And I think early on we heard a lot of companies say, well, it's hard to hire people in junior roles in remote organizations. Our data shows that hiring across different roles is basically the same. Maybe if you start out, people are worried, oh, it's going to be hard to train somebody. But if you're a remote organization where everybody works remotely, or you're just comfortable with that, remote or hybrid or whatever, yeah, we don't really see a change in the behavior of hiring organization, that they would only focus on senior or more experienced people. For what it's worth, I would encourage you to apply. I think it's really if you are looking for a job and you feel like you don't meet the bar that the company set. Most companies, they write the job specs with much more experience than in reality is required for any given job. And I would always encourage any individual to apply to the job that they think or they aspire to have.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I'll caveat what I'm about to say, that this is not from our international data, but what our own data about hiring in the US actually shows is that, especially over the last few years, as talent has gotten scarcer, businesses have, I think, made trade-offs towards more junior workers. A lot of, especially younger workers between ages 16 and 24, really picked up a lot of the slack and filled a lot of the gaps in the US labor market that was previously filled by what you could call prime age workers, right, between the ages of 24 and 54. And so, if anything, the tide sort of in the aggregate, even if not for any specific individual, is, I think, sort of very healthy for young people to sort of get in and get experience because of the sort of persistent shortage of more experienced workers, coupled with the sort of rising wave of retirements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons to look toward younger workers, and even if you're paying them less, you have many more of them. So, and if you're just optimizing cost, it still can't work. All right, our third question here is from Hazel Morgan. Hazel, thank you for asking this. What are the HR trends in terms of managing varied employee and employer expectations, especially around different work cultures? So how are you managing expectations between employee and employer around different work cultures?
Yeah, I think what we see and what we advise everybody to do is just be really clear about how do you work in this company. I think that is I think the most important thing. I'm not sure if that's the answer to the question, but I think that's the advice that we tend to give to companies, is be really clear about how do we work here and how do we do things. Then you should be okay. Like I yeah, I don't know. I think managing different cultures in a workplace is not difficult if you just clearly outline how people are expected to behave. And it doesn't have to be harsh. It can be very straightforward and simple, but nonetheless, that should be sufficient. And then making sure that managers are trained in dealing with that, and then and in general, make sure that everybody is generous in their interpretations of others.
Yeah. So I completely agree with Job. And I think I would really sort of try and plus one the point he made earlier, which is about having a clear set of values and expectations around how those values look in a workplace. So the best workplace arrangement is when there's a very good fit between the expectations of the worker and the expectations of the employer about what each can deliver, right? And so I think this question is really important from Hazel. And so what we've seen in the data is that regular values and process documentation. This is who we want to be. These are the key things, right, that you need in order to sort of access, right, any of the critical processes that we do, and so that you can fulfill, right, those expectations. And then really increasing the number of touch points. So one very big difference in managing a remote and distributed workforce and managing an in-person workforce is that managers need to spend a lot more time, more frequently with their directs, sort of making sure that the work is on track, that it's meeting outcomes, and that it's being done in a way that's consistent, right, with the values that are being communicated. And that level setting needs to happen more often so that expectations can be consistently realigned in order to sort of meet the expectations on both sides. And when you're in an in-person environment, that work happens sort of naturally, in the sense that you're all together, you're sort of doing doing that at various touch points throughout the day. And in remote and distributed teams, need to be very clear about those expectations across cultures, because the same words don't always mean the same things across cultures. And then to do that consistent setting, that consistent checking in and expectation setting, those are the two sort of real keys to doing that across borders.
Excellent. We're going to go with 2 more questions here. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. We're going to look to get this next one on the screen here. This is from Rita Ahon. What is the future for African remote workers?
It's the same for everybody else, which is you'll get far greater access to more opportunities. Most of Africa shares the time zones with most of Europe, where there's an incredible large amount of companies hiring remotely. And they are looking for great people, and great people are everywhere, including in Africa. And so we see this. We see, as we've expanded throughout Africa, we've seen more and more companies hiring there, near universally. So I'm always very happy with these kind of questions, because I always think to myself, well, nothing special for Africa, because it's the same everywhere. And there's some, some countries certainly have quicker access to certain opportunities and technologies, but in this case, remote today serves a very large part of Africa, and we will continue until we are literally everywhere. And luckily, we see a lot of companies hiring through the entire African continent, just like in the rest of the world. And so I'm extremely optimistic.
Yeah. I will say, from our research with contractors, I would just want to sort of recognize and validate. It seems like from the chat, a lot of folks from Nigeria, Kenya, et cetera, have been sort of finding it difficult. And I want to just sort of validate that experience. I think that even though they sort of share time zones, I think there's sort of like this idea about Africa as being special or sort of very difficult place to work or what have you. And I think that you all are, again, at the pointy tip of the spear to sort of break some of those stereotypes. But I do think there's opportunity. And one of the things from our international contractors research is that one of the best ways to find work as an international contractor with a company that's overseas in the United States is to work your personal and family or professional connections, right? So having somebody sort of be able to say, I know this person, right? This person does good work. And then to cultivate a long-term relationship, right, with an organization, so that then you can leverage that sort of over and over again for more work, and also, to extend that to other businesses or organizations in your network, to sort of build that out over time. It does take time. It takes time across the world. It's not specifically true for African workers, but I mean, I think that there is, to be honest, I think that I've heard lots of African workers encounter the kind of stigma around sort of being from Africa. And I don't want to discount that. I think it perhaps is more difficult for lots of people. But one of the best practices is to really demonstrate your thought leadership, demonstrate your skills on the internet, sort of be seen, and then really work the development of personal and professional networks that can connect you to opportunities overseas.
Awesome. And then our final question comes from Imelda Keen-Mother. Could you also address how contractor misclassification and PE is handled?
Yeah. So contractor misclassification is when you have a contractor that really should be an employee, so employed directly. And so that's why the model that we built at Remote, Employer of Record, exists, so that if you have a contractor and you want to employ them locally, you can do so, and you can do it through Remote, or you can do it through Gusto through Remote, which is very, very nice. And we're very, very happy about that. Permanent establishment, which is what PE stands for, is another problem where you might have, or the local government might require you to actually set up a local entity where you don't have one, right? Because you have certain economic activities there. This is something that you should definitely worry about, but you only have to worry about it if you know that you have to worry about it, which sounds a little bit circular, but it basically means if you have large activity or particular economic activity in a particular country, or very large team, this is when you should think about permanent establishment kind of issues and challenges, and being compliant for that. But high level, if you work with Remote, and I'm plugging my company very directly here, we do check these things out, right? And so if anybody is employed or paid through remote, whether they are a contractor or an employee, we always make sure to check misclassification. So you're not able to pay a contractor that you're misclassifying. We would help you to make them into an employee. And we always check for permanent establishment risk, right? We wouldn't put anybody in a difficult compliance situation.
Liz, any follow-up thoughts on contractor misclassification?
I think Job is 3 to 10 times the expert that I am about these issues. So I would just like to +1 what he said.
For sure. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for submitting your questions. We really appreciated that opportunity. And once again, thanks to our speakers, Liz and Job, and to everyone here for joining us. Again, I'm Aman Kidwai, journalist. Liz, where can we find your research and find you online and on social media?
Yeah, you can find us on the Gusto website. You can navigate to us from the homepage, or you can Google Gusto Data and Research, and you can find our homepage with all of our research. I am on LinkedIn. That's pretty much my only social platform because I find X, formerly known as Twitter, to be completely overwhelming for me. And I'm not of the TikTok generation yet.
Job, how about you? What's your TikTok? Where can we find remote? And what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Embarrassed to not have a TikTok yet. It's a matter of time, to be honest. Remote.com, can't miss it. You can find me on LinkedIn and on X. Just search by my name. It's easiest. And like, wow, how hard is it to remember somebody called Job Jaws that runs a company that helps people? It's
perfect. It's perfect alignment there. Awesome. Well, again, for our audience, if you like this session, don't forget we have one more LinkedIn Live around what you need to know when hiring your first international employee. Head to the link in the comments to register.